Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about Thursday's matches. We've got a small selection of games from Brazil's Serie A and the American MLS. So the World Cup is coming to an end, but some leagues are already starting to come back, the ones we usually cover in the summer. So I'd really appreciate your likes and comments under the video, and enjoy watching. And as usual, let's start with the earlier match. We've got Botafogo hosting Santos on their home field. It's worth noting that this season, Botafogo and Santos are playing some of the most exciting stylistic football in the Brazilian league, but you can't really say that these teams have any consistent results since they're both at the bottom of the standings. Neither Botafogo nor Santos are fighting for the championship, but both teams will probably have to deal with the struggle to avoid relegation. If we talk about the context of today's match, this game is actually quite important for both Botafogo and Santos. But in today's match, it's really hard for me to see Santos as an equal team to Botafogo, because Santos just isn't good on the road at all. The home field advantage in Brazil is a really big deal, and it turns out that Santos actually has some of the best stats this season, defensive stats. In other words, they concede quite a lot. They haven't won a single match yet. The reason for this is their pretty open style of play. The team tries to play high up the pitch, acts pretty boldly, sometimes goes for aggressive pressing, leaves their defense exposed, and of course, most opponents take advantage of that. But if you look at their recent matches, sometimes they've had opponents against whom this style of play actually worked out pretty well. But as for any kind of final result, you can't really say there's been any significant benefit from it. As for Botafogo, the situation is almost the same here. Their style, I would say, is even bolder, even more striking. But at home, Botafogo very rarely loses their matches. So far, we've seen that Botafogo hasn't played that many home games this season. But if we talk about the ones they have played, the quality has been quite good. If we're talking about teams that are in the middle or at the bottom of the standings, the team is fairly well put together, but it's still a little early for them to compete this season with the teams at the top of the standings who are fighting for the championship. But opponents like Santos are quite manageable in terms of prospects. So as for today's match, I would consider Botafogo a clear favorite in this game, but I would play it safe in case of a draw, because Santos is a gritty team that can also find their chances, and potentially hold on for a scoring draw in this match. So regarding my prediction for today's match, I would highlight an outcome like a double chance plus total goals. That is, Botafogo not to lose plus over 1.5 goals in the match. The next match for today is also in the Brazilian Serie A. Vitória will be hosting Vasco da Gama at home. If this match were taking place on neutral ground, Vasco da Gama would probably be considered the clear favorite today. But as it happens, Vitória is one of the most consistent teams when it comes to playing at home. And we can see that by the standards of the Brazilian Championship, they currently have some of the best home records. Vitória's style of play isn't exactly flashy or spectacular. The team often gives up possession and focuses on counterattacks, which they do quite well. And as we can see, all of this leads to pretty good results. They have one of the most effective defenses in the league. In today's match, Vasco da Gama is definitely going to have a tough time, because Vasco is also, in a way, a fairly defensive, closed-off team that prefers a defensive style of play. And as we can see, even this season, they don't have any outstanding attacking stats. If we talk about the potential and the quality of play, Vasco da Gama probably has much more variety, but how they will break through Vitória's defense in today's match is pretty hard to say. Many people might point out that Vitória has some squad issues. There really are a lot of players who can't take part in this match. But I wouldn't say that this is a really significant detail, because if we talk about the core of the team, almost all the main players can basically take part in this match. So, as for today's game, I would probably highlight that Vitória has a pretty good chance at least not to lose this match. And of course, I wouldn't expect a lot of goals here, considering the playing style of both teams. So, my prediction is Vitória not to lose, plus a total of under 3.5 goals, and also under 4.5 goals. Basically, the odds line for this match is pretty good, so you can go for the higher end of the lower total. The next match is going to be a game from the MLS. Montreal will be hosting Toronto on their home field. As for these teams, they're quite interesting when it comes to the Eastern Conference. And in today's match, a lot of people are expecting a pretty specific style of football here. Because on one hand, Montreal and Toronto are both somewhat critical teams when it comes to defense. But specifically, Montreal at home and Toronto away tend to favor a more rational style of play, which, for the most part, doesn't usually end with a lot of goals scored or conceded. Because Montreal tries to focus on getting results first and foremost when playing at home, and they're pretty good at it, since they're one of the top teams in the league standings in terms of points earned. Of course, they're not the absolute best in this regard, but they're quite good, especially considering their modest roster of players. As for Toronto, at home, they try to play as aggressively as possible, traditionally creating a huge number of chances and playing with a high defensive line, which of course leads to opportunities for their opponents near their own goal. And they really do concede a lot, but when playing away, they try to play in a more rational way. And you can't really say that they're super effective at it because they still concede a lot of goals, but at the same time, they don't score much either, since they mostly focus all their efforts on defense. That's why, in the US, you need to pay attention to behavioral patterns. So it turns out that when it comes to home and away games, teams act pretty consistently, but in very different ways. So as for today's match, I really think Montreal looks like the favorite. We can see that there's quite a significant amount of money being placed on them if we're talking about the betting line. And as for my prediction for this match, I probably wouldn't expect a huge number of goals here, like 5 or 6, for example. But I think that Montreal is very likely not to lose this match. So my pick for this match is Montreal not to lose, plus under 4.5 total goals. The next match for today is also going to be an MLS game. Chicago Fire will play against Vancouver, and here both teams will meet, each being one of the leaders of their respective conferences, Western and Eastern respectively, and both display some of the most aggressive styles of play. Of course, you could say that both teams are, in a way, quite balanced in terms of defensive potential, because they don't concede a lot of goals, but they do score a decent amount. That's why, when it comes to matches, whether they're within the same conference or between different conferences, these games are often quite exciting, interesting, and eventful in terms of goals. So today, it's no surprise that many people here are expecting a pretty high level of goal-scoring activity, and of course, I'm also expecting a lot of goals today. If we talk about the lineups and the selection of players, the situation's actually pretty good right now. Almost all the key players on both sides will be able to take part in this match, which could further contribute to a strong goal-scoring outlook for today's game. So here, you could probably look for some options regarding individual totals. You could also consider some outcomes based on the overall total here, but between these teams, I simply expect both sides to score. So my prediction for today's match between these teams is simply that both teams will score. The odds aren't super high there because, well, the matchup suggests it. There's a real potential for goals here, so I'm not going to come up with anything extra or unnecessary. The next match for today is also from the MLS Western Conference. St. Louis will be hosting Kansas City on their home field. As for this match, naturally, a lot of people aren't expecting any outstanding football here, because both teams are at the bottom of the standings. But given the specifics of the game, you can actually expect some interesting football here, because St. Louis is a fairly defensive, pragmatic team that doesn't have a strong attacking potential. However, considering they're playing against Sporting Kansas from Kansas City, you could naturally expect some goals here, since Sporting is one of the most vulnerable teams defensively when it comes to away matches. On average, they concede more than 3 goals per game. And there are quite a lot of problems in their defense. The team plays very poorly man-to-man. Their zonal coverage is structurally weak, and they often struggle during transitional phases of the game. So it turns out that even with their modest attacking potential, St. Louis can still manage to score some goals. Yeah, if you compare St. Louis's defense to Sporting's, you could rate it quite highly. But today, Sporting might have a pretty strong argument in terms of their own decent goal-scoring activity and chances. That's because St. Louis often tries to play openly and aggressively at home. I mean, well, in MLS, we actually see this pretty often, but not from every team. So it turns out that even though St. Louis presents itself as a fairly defensive team, they still quite often leave their back line exposed. And in general, other teams can take advantage of that pretty often. So even if we talk about this current season, St. Louis often shows solid quality play at home. But even then, teams from the lower part of the standings often score a decent number of goals against them. And in today's match, Kansas City will definitely have those kinds of opportunities. So, as for today's prediction for this match, I would also expect both teams to score. The next match today is also from the MLS. The Seattle Sounders will be hosting the Portland Timbers at home. And here, both teams are coming into this match not in the best form, based on their recent results. But considering that quite a lot of time has passed since their last matches, almost 2 seasons in fact, naturally the situation here has changed, but it's unlikely that it has changed in terms of the context of the game itself and what the teams show on the field. Speaking of Seattle, this is a pretty systematic team, I would say. Quite serious, often focusing on results, but in home games, that doesn't stop them from playing some really bright, versatile, and interesting soccer. But even so, it's still hard to call them truly super high scoring. Although, in today's match, many people are actually expecting a high scoring game against the Portland Timbers, because when it comes to defense, Portland really lags behind almost every team in their Western Conference when playing away. So when it comes to today's match, it's not for nothing that people expect Seattle to win, but there's a catch here. If you look at the average odds, you'd have to bet on negative handicaps here and expect the Seattle Sounders to win by several goals, which is honestly hard for me to do, because I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Portland could be extremely passive in attack. Of course, the team has defensive problems, but at the same time, they have a pretty decent counterattacking game, and they're quite strong on set pieces. So I'd probably just stick to options in favor of the Seattle Sounders and their attacking capabilities in today's match. Well, let's call it their attacking potential. The odds aren't exactly huge, but I think all the other options carry pretty significant risks. So for today's match, my prediction would be a rather modest one in terms of odds. Seattle Sounders individual total over 1.5 goals.